Before you guys listen to the stories, could you please help support us by liking and subscribing to this new channel? Most of you watching aren't subscribed, so please help us grow. We really appreciate it. Now on to the stories. The GPS lady's chipper voice had become a cruel taunt. 2 hours into the drive, the comforting blue line on the phone screen had morphed into a squiggly mess, then vanished altogether. Grandma's cryptic directions, "Follow the winding road until you see the old oak with the red ribbon," echoed in my head, a cruel joke in the face of my predicament. The sun, once a cheerful presence in the rearview mirror, was sinking lower, casting long, disturbing shadows across the narrow dirt road. The towering pines, once majestic sentinels, now seemed to loom menacingly, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers clawing at the diminishing light. A low groan from the engine ripped through the uneasy silence. Smoke, a sickly sweet smell, wafted out from under the hood. Fantastic. My night spent watching car restoration shows on YouTube apparently hadn't equipped me to deal with a real breakdown. Panic clawed at my throat, but I forced it down. Grandma would be livid if I panic. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my backpack and stepped out of the car, the silence of the forest pressing in on me like a physical force. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, a comforting aroma if it weren't for the unsettling quiet. It wasn't the comforting chirping of crickets or the hooting of owls. It was a silence so profound it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Pulling out my phone's pathetic excuse for a flashlight, I gingerly popped the hood. Engine guts stared back at me, a tangled mess of wires and metal that meant nothing to me. So much for my automotive expertise, honed from years of watching YouTube tutorials. Defeated, I slammed the hood shut. Alone with my thoughts, the forest, once peaceful, now felt like a living entity watching me. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent chills down my spine. Then I heard it. A faint voice, barely a whisper carry on the wind, a word that seemed to hang in the air. Help. My blood ran cold. It wasn't an animal. It was human, laced with a deep undercurrent of fear. My first instinct was to run back to the car, a flimsy metal barrier against whatever danger lurked in the woods. But the voice, a single word uttered with such desperation, tugged at my conscience. Maybe it was someone else lost, someone who needed help. My grandma, a seasoned hiker with a healthy disregard for danger, would have gone in without a second thought. Hesitantly, I aimed my phone's meager flashlight in the direction of the sound and began walking. The forest floor crunched under my feet, an unnerving counterpoint to the unsettling silence that had resumed. The open road stretched out before me like an endless ribbon of possibility as I set out on my much-anticipated road trip to the cabin in the woods. With a cooler full of snacks, a carefully curated playlist, and a tank full of gas, I felt invincible, ready to conquer whatever adventures lay ahead. But as the miles ticked by and the scenery grew more remote, an unsettling realization began to dawn on me. The trusty GPS that had never failed me before was suddenly coming up empty, unable to locate the secluded cabin address I triple-checked before leaving. At first, I tried to brush off the growing unease, chalking it up to spotty service in the boonies. I mean, what's a road trip without a little spontaneity and off-the-beaten-path exploration, right? But as the hours dragged on and the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting eerie shadows across the deserted backroads, my confidence started to waver. Just as I was about to give up hope and start scouting for a place to turn around, I spotted a weathered wooden sign peeking out from the overgrown brush. Whispering Pines Cabins, 1 mile ahead. Bingo! With renewed determination, I veered off onto the narrow dirt path, gravel crunching beneath my tires as I navigated the twists and turns. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, the last slivers of daylight had given way to an inky black sky, punctuated by a smattering of stars. Grabbing my bags from the trunk, I bounded up the creaky porch steps, eager to get inside and unwind after the long journey. But as I reached for the doorknob, I discovered it was stuck fast, like someone had sealed it shut from the other side. Frustration mounting, I circled around the perimeter of the cabin, scanning for any signs of a spare key. A decorative flower pot caught my eye, its ceramic surface cracked and chipped from years of neglect. Bingo again. Triumphantly clutching the rusty key, I returned to the front door, grateful for the bit of good fortune. But as I slid the key into the lock, a sudden gust of wind sent a chill down my spine. The door was already cracked open, swaying gently in the breeze. Hesitantly, I pushed it open further, straining to see into the pitch-black void beyond the threshold. A musty smell wafted out, mingling with the crisp pine air. Fumbling for my phone, I flicked on the flashlight and stepped inside. The narrow beam illuminated a scene straight out of a horror movie. Overturned furniture, shattered glass, and claw marks gouged into the wooden walls. It looked like a wild animal had torn through the place in a frenzy. Heart pounding, I backed slowly towards the door, ready to make a break for it. But as I spun around, the door slammed shut with a sickening thud. I yanked on the handle with all my might, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. That's when I heard it, a low guttural growl emanating from the shadows at the far end of the room. A pair of glowing eyes emerged from the darkness, fixated on me with predatory intent. Fight or flight instinct kicked into overdrive. Bracing my shoulder, I threw my entire weight into the door again and again, until it finally gave way with a splintering crack. I tumbled out onto the porch, barely keeping my footing as I bolted for the car. But in my haste, I lost my grip on the keys. They clattered to the ground, disappearing into the dense underbrush just beyond the porch steps. On hands and knees, I frantically searched for them, pulse quickening as the ominous growls grew louder. Tears of terror clouding my eyes, my fingers finally closed around the key ring. I dashed back to the car and peeled out in a spray of gravel, not daring to look back. Safely behind the wheel, I sped off into the night, putting as much distance as possible between myself and that accursed cabin. But even as the miles melted away, I couldn't shake the feeling of those eyes boring into me, imprinted with sickening clarity onto my mind's eye. From that moment forth, my perspective on travel was forever altered. Even now, every time I book a cozy getaway or remote retreat, I can't help but wonder what lurks just beyond the well-manicured facade, waiting to lure unsuspecting victims into its trap. Nature is a cruel mistress, capable of breathtaking beauty and unfathomable horror all at once. And if my experience taught me anything, it's that sometimes the real monsters aren't the ones we conjure up in ghost stories around the campfire, but the ones stalking us from the shadows, biding their time until we're our most vulnerable. So if you're ever on the road to a secluded cabin, and things start to feel a little too quiet, a little too perfect, trust the gut instinct telling you to turn back, because you never know just how close you might be to crossing paths with something truly terrifying. Ah, Paris, the city of love, lights, and apparently, the occasional bout of in-flight insanity. At least that's what I was beginning to think as I boarded my red-eye from London, already dreading the impending jet lag and recycled air. As I shuffled down the aisle, double-checking my boarding pass like a neurotic squirrel, I spotted my designated row, and that's when I saw them, the passenger in the window seat, clad head to toe in an oversized black hoodie that obscured every identifying feature. Great, I thought to myself. Just my luck to get stuck next to some aspiring Unabomber for the next 7 hours. But as I awkwardly clambered over their outstretched legs to reach my coveted middle seat, I caught a glimpse of their face beneath the hood. Or rather, the lack thereof. Where there should have been eyes, a nose, a mouth, any semblance of human features, there was only a hollow gaping void. A chill ran down my spine as I quickly averted my gaze, convinced it had to be a trick of the harsh cabin lighting. Throughout the flight, I couldn't shake the unnerving presence beside me. Every time I stole a glance in their direction, that empty chasm where a face should have been seemed to grow darker, more consuming. Sleep eluded me as my mind raced with increasingly paranoid theories. Was this some kind of twisted prank? A hallucination brought on by the altitude and one too many mini vodkas? Or, God forbid, something else entirely? Somewhere over the English Channel, I couldn't take it anymore. Mumbling an excuse about stretching my legs, I practically leapt over the hooded figure and made a beeline for the lavatory, desperate for a moment of solace to collect my thoughts. Splashing cold water on my face, I stared at my ashen reflection in the mirror, wondering if I was losing my grip on reality. The confined space suddenly felt suffocating, the drone of the engines morphing into a sinister hum that reverberated through my skull. Steeling my nerves, I took a deep breath and emerged back into the dimly lit cabin. But as I approached my row, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The hooded figure was gone. Not just gone, but vanished without a trace, like they had never existed at all. The window seat sat empty, the tray table pristine and untouched. Panic rising in my throat, I flagged down the nearest flight attendant, a look of bewilderment plastered across my face. I gestured towards the vacant seat, trying to keep my voice steady as I inquired about its former occupant. But the attendant just stared at me blankly, a flicker of concern crossing her features. According to her, that seat had been empty since takeoff. No one had ever occupied it, let alone some faceless entity in a black hoodie. She asked if I was feeling all right, if I needed some water, or perhaps a bit of rest. But I barely heard her words over the pounding of my own heart. How could that be possible? I had physically stepped over them, felt the brush of their legs against mine. This couldn't be happening. I sank back in my seat, hands trembling as I gripped the armrests with white knuckles. The cabin suddenly felt too quiet, too still, like the calm before an impending storm. For the remainder of the flight, I sat rigid and unblinking, too terrified to let my guard down for even a second. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in my periphery sent jolts of adrenaline surging through my veins. When we finally touched down at Charles de Gaulle, I practically sprinted off the plane, not even bothering to grab my overhead luggage. I just needed to put as much distance between myself and that cursed aircraft as possible. In the weeks that followed, I tried to rationalize the incident, convince myself it had all been a stress-induced hallucination. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. A brush was something far beyond the realm of logical explanation. Even now, years later, I still can't bring myself to fly without a creeping sense of unease. Every time I board a plane, I find myself scanning the faces of my fellow passengers, searching for any sign of that hooded figure lurking in the shadows. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the true horrors of this world don't always announce themselves with fangs and claws. Sometimes, they sit right beside us, cloaked in the mundane, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal their true nature. So the next time you find yourself 30,000 feet in the air, sandwiched between strangers, take a moment to really look at the person next to you, and pray that what looks back is of this earth. Because trust me, you don't want to know what lies beneath.